Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Matthew Keegan, and I'm the Moynihan Assistant Professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Cultures at Barnard College. I'd like to thank the Columbia Global Center in Amman and the staff there for hosting this wonderful series of events and workshops where we are discussing Kalīla wa-Dimna, a series of stories that feature fictional humans and talking animals. Thank you all for coming to this first of our academic workshops, which follows the keynote discussion that we had last week, which is posted online. Today, we will be discussing the digital Kalīla wa-Dimna, digital humanities, and digital editions. But for those of you who missed last week, let me catch you up. The tales of Kalīla wa-Dimna have traveled from Sanskrit to Middle Persian, to Arabic and Syriac, and then from Arabic to languages all across the world, from French and English to Malay and Japanese. In a series of workshops this month, every Monday in July, we are discussing various aspects of the ERC-sponsored project led by Beatrice Grundler, which is held at the Freie Universität Berlin. This project is entitled AnonymClassic, and it's made up of over a dozen researchers, programmers, and staff from all over the world working on a synoptic edition of Kalīla wa-Dimna and to better understand the transmission of Kalīla wa-Dimna. As we learned last week in the keynote conversation, creating a traditional edition of the Arabic Kalīla wa-Dimna is really a sort of impossibility. There is no author's original, and there's also no translator's original. Ibn Muqaffa translated the book in the 8th century AD, and our earliest manuscript comes from the 13th century AD. And then to complicate things further, there are hundreds of manuscripts, and they often differ greatly from one another. And what this means is that copyists were acting as co-authors, adding, reinterpreting, changing early manuscripts. And we do know that this was a manuscript tradition rather than an oral tradition, when you can see that copyists are reinterpreting words with new words that actually look very similar to the earlier words. They've just changed where the dots go, or they've changed a letter here or there. So the AnonymClassic project that we're discussing in these workshops is currently working towards a synoptic edition, which would allow people to see these different versions side by side. And currently underway is a synoptic edition of one chapter of Kalīla wa-Dimna. So to achieve this synoptic edition, the team members of AnonymClassic have been transcribing manuscripts and comparing and visualizing them on a digital platform. This digital humanities aspect of the project is what we're here to discuss today. In future workshops, next Monday and the Monday after that, we will talk more about the Arabic versions of the text and its transmission between languages. And you can sign up for these future workshops in the links provided in the chat box. Let me introduce our panelists for today, and then I will hand it over to our first panelist. First, we have Mahmoud Kozai. Mahmoud is a research fellow for the AnonymClassic project, and he is our head programmer. He received his bachelor's in engineering from Tanta University in Egypt, and he has a second BA in Arabic studies from the Freie Universität Berlin, and he's working on a few master's degrees at the moment. We also have Theodore Beers. Theo is a Persian and Arabic philologist who has recently defended his dissertation at the University of Chicago, where he wrote on the development of the Persian literary anthology tradition in Timurid and Safavid eras. In Berlin, he works on the transmission and translation of materials connected to Kalīla wa-Dimna, especially between Arabic and Persian, but he also does some programming of small-scale digital projects, which he'll be talking about today. We have two discussants today. We have Sarah Bowen-Savant, who is a professor at the Aga Khan University in London, where she specializes in the cultural history of the Middle East and Iran. She is also the principal investigator for the digital humanities project entitled Knowledge, Information, Technology, and the Arabic Book, aka Kitab. And we also have Maxim Romanov, who is a Universität Assistent for Digital Humanities at the Institute for History, University of Vienna. He has worked on numerous digital humanities projects dealing with computational techniques, for interpreting large bodies of textual material in Arabic, and he is a senior research fellow at the Kitab Project. Now, we will have 2 presentations, responses from our 2 discussants, and then we will have a Q&A where we'll have a few more panelists to join us. But throughout the conversation, I encourage you to use the Q&A box to post your questions. The earlier you post your questions as they occur to you, the easier it will be for me to feed them to the panelists during the Q&A. So I will be keeping track of that box and will be feeding the questions to our panelists after the keynote or after the presentations and discussions. So without further ado, let me pass this over to Mahmoud for the first presentation. Mahmoud?
Thanks, Matt. Welcome to all the participants, and I hope the presentation will be enjoyable and informative for you. So I just get started by sharing my screen. What I'm going to talk about is like 2 main points: my understanding of what digital humanities is and what kind of software we are developing. My all-time favorite quote is the most widely known things are the least understood, which is a very common practice when it comes to talking about DH and what DH is. It means different things to different people. And the generalization itself, humanities, what's humanities? There are history, there's archaeology, there are many things. Still, I'm not going to present a conclusive definition. I'm just pushing people to think about it, and often the definition is project specific. Like there are lots of sets of activities within each project, and the definition is always project specific. So I'm just going, like it helps to have a definition as something to start with that is descriptive of the activity or the problem in hand. So in the Kalīla wa-Dimna project, the ultimate goal is to present a digital edition. So this activity is in itself is textual scholarship, but there are other things that are being done as well to support this practice. So we use computers, we use software, we construct data, we collect data. But again, when it comes to discussion, you find people have different conceptions for what that is. So I'm just going to go quickly. What's a textual scholar? I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. What's a computer? A computer is an entity that takes symbolic instructions and compares data. And the software is these symbolic instructions, and the data is records of things. That's the very plain definitions. I find people sometimes jump into details and associate data with certain structure or certain technology. That can be problematic and limiting. Use XML, while there are many other technologies that can be helpful to support the practice. The definitions will remain inconclusive, but it's something important to think about. The ultimate goal is that to make a difficult text accessible. We have this textual tradition exists in many languages, in many variations. It's not really that easy to understand. So this is the ultimate goal, to make a hard text accessible. It took me a lot of time to reach this definition and to make sense of what I'm doing, because I'm doing a lot of things. I'm doing programming, I'm doing transcription, I'm reading history. So reaching this definition was very helpful for me to be the solid ground. Every time I get lost in the details, I have to make sure that everything that I do served this purpose, that I have to curate the text and make it possible. Of course, there is the textual scholar and the textual scholarship project. So we have to, it has different people doing different activities that all revolves around reading and describing, tabulating insights, and many other things that will help us make the text presentable at the end. And these activities is done, humans do it in their own way. Everyone has their own rhythm in using a computer or using a pen and paper. So here comes digital humanities to make the lives of the scholar easier by software. And the line isn't clear. Where does traditional scholarship stop and digital humanities start? The use of software and managing files and using word processors is almost becoming a life skill. So when is it really a scholarly practice? There is no answer to that. It's still, is the text being well curated and is it made accessible at the end? We are in a project that is relatively large and has lots of people with different background working on it. And the activities like digitizing is not one thing. It's not the simple inputting of a text on a computer. There are multiple steps, and every time we digitize, we generate a visualization. We use a software to put text side by side, and we keep going back to what we do. So what's the rule of software is that? For me, the main question is a question of automation. What a human does and what a computer does. This is a partial list of what kind of activities get carried out in the project. We have the transcription, have the collation, putting text side by side. We have gathering manuscripts. Is the fact that we buy a manuscript from a library and get it per email. Is this digital humanities? The fact that you get it per email. Like there's a certain way to keep it structured, but now the idea, now the main question in that I've been focusing on is the automation. How to make the task easier for the scholars in the project, and in the same time generate structured data. So let's go for transcribing, for example. People usually would use Microsoft Word. We have the facsimile in one side and the Word document in one side. And when we transcribe, we keep each line true to a line in the manuscript. And that's how we can always locate the position of a word if we'd like to correct it and revise it. Here, of course, comes the problem of homogeneity. People use different, maybe not everyone uses Microsoft Word. Someone uses OpenOffice, people use different fonts and so on. So a problem of inconsistency appears as each one uses their own software. Another step in the project is the collation. We had to produce XML files in this manner. We dissect the text into passages, and each passage gets an XML ID, and we reuse these XML IDs while when dissecting another manuscript, and this way we can use Lyra later to collate text and put matching passages next to one another. So far, we use this basic software that I showed that everyone uses, and Lyra, and there are certain tasks that we use by using the various programming languages. There isn't enough time really to talk about this, the automation of a repetitive task, but sometimes you need to rename a bulk of files or split images at once. So you write a short script to automate this task. So a quick look at Lyra. It's a project that had existed for a while. I encourage you to go to the website and know the full potential of this software. We used to produce XML files the way I showed you then. But after uploading the XML files, the layer automatically puts the texts side by side. For me, I plan to migrate from using all this and having our own software. There are a lot of great people in digital humanities producing great things, but there has been certain problems that pushed me to develop something from the ground up. Many three great examples are TextGrid, Ediarum, and Transcripus. All three of them are in Java, which was problematic for me because I prefer to work with other programming languages. Our desktop applications, working with desktop applications is problematic in a sense. If you have different people having different devices, you have to set it up for everyone. So it's a big coordinating issue. I went for a web interface. Also, Ediarum, for example, is a plug-in for Oxygen, which is a proprietary software. And I didn't feel like developing plug-in for a proprietary software. I wanted to develop something that is completely open source. Also, it has a compatibility problem with Arabic. So, like, to sum up these issues, like there aren't many specialized software for textual scholarship. They are based on XML. The application is one big complicated piece, makes customizing it not easy, and the communication with the author, like academics have busy life. We couldn't really get to them and know how to adjust the software for our needs. And now I'm running out of time. Very quickly, just get to the highlight of the presentation. The software that I have developed so far as a reimagination of the workflow of transcription. So we have a set of tools. The transcription process is in 3 stages: layout detection, layout analysis, line detection, and then the transcription. I need to get the Windows blocking. Yeah. Sorry. So in a transcription workflow, an editor would usually describe the different folio pieces by highlighting, then define selection as a layout element. We have certain sets of layout elements that are specific to our project. This should be adjustable depending or configurable depending on the project. And we have here an image element. So image and main body. And we have one more. Main body. And we have 2 legends on the side. This copyist writes legends twice. It's an eccentricity of his. That do the rotation. Legend. One more legend. So this is the first step, the step of a layout analysis. After the layout analysis is done, you can do line detection. Yeah, each line gets its own box. There are some like always, some adjustment is needed. The software is not exact. The user does the adjustment very quickly. This is extra, and this is extra. Save and close. No, the zoom controls keeps blocking me from moving through the windows. And finally, there is a transcription interface where the user puts line by line. The workflow like this is more pleasant and gives me control on what the user inputs. This software right now is only built for our needs. I plan and like I'm focusing on the openness and the reusability by the code of the code. It's still, there are many technical challenges, but I plan on making it an option that is fully available and adjustable for the community. We still have a lot of points to figure out in ERC regulations on how to license and release the code, but I followed a certain architectural practices where usability and adjustability and extensibility should be easy, which I find many individuals in the community have not followed so far, due to many factors, like academic life is hard, and there hasn't been good and also interdisciplinary communication has been always tough. But I'm very optimistic that it's going to be an open source solution that can be easily adjustable for other projects in the community. I hope this has been informative for you, and I give the word to Matt now.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud. Before you quit your screen, never mind.
Yeah, I was too quickly. I can share it again. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you just do the transcription really quick? Like show what doing a transcription on that interface looks like. I think that's really interesting to look at, because you had the transcription set up here. So what does a transcriber do at this point?
Yeah, just input the text.
Okay. And then this will line up. Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. I think thank you so much, Mahmoud. We are now moving to Theo's presentation. Theo, the mic is yours.
Great. So now I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. And before I share my screen, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's participating. Thanks to Dr. Savant and Romanov for being our discussants. And thank you to Mahmoud for your very illuminating introduction to the software that you're architecting for our project. I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully. Let me know if things come up. Are we?
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint now.
Perfect. So what I'll be talking about is maybe a little bit, well, maybe not more general, but certainly simpler in a lot of ways than what Mahmoud discussed. Although I'm going to start on a similar point about defining or not defining the digital humanities. And what I wanted to say on this first is something very similar to what Mahmoud said, is that it's impossible really to arrive at a satisfying definition of the digital humanities. And I think if you ask people to define what this is, what qualifies as DH work, any one of us is going to be inclined to give an answer that's very, very generous and very broad, because there are so many ways for us to apply digital technologies to our research and our teaching. And all of them are valid, and they're part of our work on a daily basis, regardless of the extent to which we're consciously thinking about them. And I'm sure none of us would want to limit what could qualify as digital humanities, formally speaking. However, I think there is also a prevailing practical idea of what the digital humanities are, in that most of us, most of the time, if we think of a digital humanities project, we're probably going to have a certain type of thing in mind, namely a relatively large, well-established project which has secured external funding, a project that has staff both on the side of researchers who are experts in the subject matter under investigation, and also specialists in computing and software design and implementation. And there may also be something of a bias in favor of digital humanities projects in which there's software that's developed and used in a way that becomes very integral to the generation of research insights. So something like distance reading, where you're using software to analyze an enormous corpus of textual sources that a person unassisted by technology would have no hope of ever getting through, right? So we have, I think we do have this sort of practical idea that there's a certain kind of project that is the quintessential digital humanities project, or something that we tend to think of more than the other numerous possibilities that we might acknowledge. And I can't say anything really negative about projects like this because, well, I'm working for one of them. AnonymClassic certainly fits that model. So does the Kitab project. And there are a number of others that we can cite. There's a project in Hamburg on contemporary bioethics and the history of the unborn in Islam. There's the Bibliotheca Arabica in Leipzig. There's a project in Utrecht called Census. There's a project, I think headquartered at Harvard, called Women's Worlds in Qajar, Iran, which has been very influential. There's a project, Ptolemaios Arabus et Latinus in Munich, and we could go on and on. This is just a handful of examples that came to my mind when I was putting my slides together. And of course, these are projects that are important and are doing valuable research, and I'm very glad that they exist, not least because I'm working for one of them. However, I do have a few concerns with what might be referred to as the big project model in the digital humanities. First, and most importantly, I've gotten a sense from speaking with other researchers that people sometimes have the idea that getting involved in the digital humanities means either joining or starting a large collaboration of this sort, right? That if you want to be a digital humanities practitioner, well, you write a big grant and hire some software developers, or you join a project as a postdoc where that's already going on. And I think that can lead to a sense of barriers to entry, right? An idea among people that maybe they'd like to get involved in digital humanities, but think of it as something where it would require some kind of affiliation with a large-scale project. That's just a sense that I've gotten from talking to people, and that's really the concern that I have that's most relevant to this presentation. I do have a few other concerns with this big project model. One of them is wondering what's going to happen to the grant-funded projects of today, 10 or 20 years from now. A lot of these projects are supported by funding that's on a term of 5 years or maybe a bit more than that. And when a project is incepted, or when the inception of a project depends on external funding, I think it always raises the question of what happens when that funding runs out and people go their separate ways. Does the project come to a screeching halt? What are the plans for custodianship of the software and data? Will it be open sourced? Will people be able to continue using these things far into the future? So that's something I think about a lot in terms of AnonymClassic and other projects of this kind. Another concern would be simply that raising money and putting together a team and having a public-facing project like this can raise expectations, which then have to be met, or people could be disappointed. In software development and in video game development, there's often the use of a term vaporware to refer to projects that are extensively hyped and then in one way or another fail to meet those expectations. Anyway, again, I want to reiterate that large externally grant-funded projects like these are good and important. I would just want to see them as part of a strong ecosystem in the digital humanities, where there would also be a lot of smaller projects that either individuals or small groups of individuals could be carrying out on a less formal basis, less reliant on funding and institutional support, so that projects of different types and at different scales could be in synergy with one another. And then the question is, well, how can we encourage the development of that kind of robust ecosystem? I won't pretend to have the answer to such a question, but one answer that I have, at least in my own, the recent years of my own career, is that I think we can enrich this field if more researchers, just ordinary researchers in the humanities, in Islamic studies and Near Eastern studies, devoted a little bit of their time in whatever way they can, in whatever way they like, to making small contributions to building digital tools and resources, defined as broadly as possible. This could mean blogging, this could mean podcasting, or editing Wikipedia entries, adding to online bibliographies, or any number of other things. One of my chosen pursuits has been to build simple web applications that just run as websites with client-side JavaScript. I'm going to talk about a few of those in a moment. But just generally this idea that if people just took a couple hours of their week to try to contribute in some way to the digital tools and resources that are out there helping humanities research and teaching in our fields, then that could be really enriching. And there are a couple of ways that I think about this. One way is that, well, instead of worrying about what qualifies as the digital humanities, perhaps we could focus on becoming digital humanists. And what would that mean? Or we could think about cultivating a practice of everyday DH. That's been one of my catchphrases recently. And this would involve only a regular minor investment of time, wouldn't require any external funding. Yeah, and many of our colleagues are already engaged in such efforts. I think I've seen more of this kind of activity happening this year than in any prior year, certainly. Podcasting in our field seems to have taken off in a big way recently, which is great to see. But I'd like to see even more of it, and I'd like to see people thinking of it in a positive way. This is how we turn ourselves into digital humanists and contribute to an overall ecosystem. So I'll just show a few projects, a few very small side projects that I've launched over the years. I'm going to exit my PowerPoint and go into a web browser for a moment. But before I do that, I just want to say that you'll notice that a lot of the things that I put online look very similar. And that's because I use a lot of the same open source tools for all of them, just to make it as fast and painless as possible, to put a responsive layout, to put a responsive web page layout online, because I'm definitely not focusing on making things that are pretty. I just want to make little functional tools for myself. Can you still see me? Can you still see my screen at this point? Is anyone else there?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay.
We're now on the abjad calculator.
Yeah, so this is a simple one that I made. It's just an abjad calculator where you can enter some text into this box. I've pre-filled it with the basmala just to show what goes on with it. There are a couple options, but for the most part, you just press the go button, and then it gives you the abjad value of that string in the result pane. This one, of course, is 786. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this particular abjad calculation, but there are a lot of reasons that you might want the abjad value of some Arabic or Persian text. And certainly for me as a Persian literature specialist, there are all kinds of chronograms that I'm always looking at, and it's just way faster for me to be able to calculate the value automatically through a tool like this. Another one that I've put online is a simple calendar conversion utility tailored to the needs of Near East historians. I adapted this from a much larger calendar conversion page by a guy named John Walker. He placed that in the public domain. I adapted the parts of it that are relevant to my work, namely the Gregorian, Julian, Islamic, and Persian or solar Hijri calendars. And the way this works is that you enter a date into any of these, click calculate, and it populates the relevant or the equivalent dates in the other calendars. So I've pre-filled Julian here with the date of Al-Ghazali's death. And if I click calculate, then it converts all the other ones to the equivalent dates. So right, that's in Jumada al-Akhir of 505. And the other thing that I added to this, which is probably only of relevance to certain Iranian historians, but is relevant for me, is that this will show the animal sign associated with the given date in the Persianate's adaptation of the Chinese Uyghur zodiac system, right? The cycle of 12 animals that we go through, which was also used by some Persian historians, especially of the Safavid period. So I added that as well, but this is just another very simple tool. And then an even simpler one that I put online just a few months ago. This is just a character picker that if you happen to be Romanizing Arabic or Persian text and you're having trouble getting a certain diacritic that you want, this allows you to just copy it by clicking the one that you want, and then you can paste it into whatever document you're working on. So this is one of the simplest things that I've done, but I use it on a semi-regular basis. If I'm typing something on my phone and I want access to a diacritic, or if I'm working on someone else's computer and I don't have my usual keyboard layout that gives me all the diacritics that I want. So this is an example of something incredibly simple that I just put a simple web page with some simple JavaScript behind it that handles telling it which character to place in your clipboard. Very, very easy. Only took a few hours, but I use it, and it's publicly available in case anyone else wants to use it. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about one more, but let me bounce back to my PowerPoint real quick, because the next one that I want to talk about, to sort of bring things full circle. So I began talking about big DH projects and what goes on with them, and then I sort of segued into talking about small side projects that we can engage in as digital humanists. But I've sort of seen the two merge in my own work, because I saw an opportunity through the AnonymClassic project to put together a very simple web app of the sort that I also do by myself for my own side projects. And this one is called Kalīla Reader, and it's just a simple web application that facilitates reading a variety of published versions of Kalīla wa-Dimna in a whole bunch of different languages. For the time being, it's available through my personal domain. I think it'll eventually be integrated into Mahmoud's platform, but we're not quite there yet. And this I started as just a minor side project for the benefit of AnonymClassic team members. Of course, our main work is building a synoptic digital edition based on Arabic manuscripts of Kalīla wa-Dimna. But as you can imagine, we're constantly needing to refer to different published versions of all different sort of translations and adaptations of Kalīla wa-Dimna from all different literary traditions. And to make that as easy as possible, I built this very simple tool where you just select the chapter that you want, for instance, the chapter of the Ring Dove. You select the version that you want, for instance, the Persian version by Nasrullah Munshi, and then it just populates this box on the page with the relevant PDF file. So all this is just a collection of PDF files with a very lightweight user interface on top of it that just lets you select the chapter that you want and the version. And if I wanted to then switch to the Arabic edition of Abdul Wahab Azam, fine, I can switch to that. So very, very simple, but also useful. Of course, something like Kalīla Reader does not compare at all to the big platform that is being architected under Mahmoud's leadership. But my whole idea here is that we can think both big and small, and that everyone can benefit if we don't restrict our thoughts about the digital humanities to sort of large-scale, longer-term projects. That's pretty much all I have to say. I put a slide with a few further reading items, websites that I check to see what they've recently written about, being digital humanists in our field. And two that I like in particular are the Digital Orientalist and Hazine, because they both have a sort of perspective of individual researchers can be diving in and getting their hands dirty and working with digital tools and digital resources and building new ones on our own. So sort of very can-do attitude. And that attitude is also embodied in a new book by Cornelis van Lith, the founder of the Digital Orientalist. He has a new book with Brill called Among Digitized Manuscripts. You can get a PDF of that for free. And he has the same kind of attitude of, how to get into this stuff on your own, regardless of your level of experience with software engineering. And I think that should do it for me. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Theo. We will now pass it over to our discussants. For the first discussant, we have Maxim Romanov. And do keep in mind, if you are having questions of your own after these presentations, start typing them into the Q&A box so that I can sort of curate them for the discussion and feed them to the participants later on. Maxime.
Thank you for inviting me to comment. It's very interesting research. Mahmoud already shared his work with me and showed what he developed. I personally consider it to be a very, really amazing work. But I also have some reservations about this kind of approach. And it has a lot to do with how we define digital humanities. As Theo rightly, justly noted that it's very difficult to define it, but we can still have a sort of some kind of a working operating definition in order at least to encompass the kind of work that we do. One comment that I really wanted to make here is there's a significant difference between the developers and researchers, even though the people can have the exact same, let's say, training, right? Both can do programming, but there's a very different thing to do a development and a very different thing to do research, right? In one case, you're trying to develop tools, in another case, you're trying to find answers to humanistic problems, right? That's, in my view, that's digital humanities. But again, I'm talking about my definition. I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. Another thing here is also the significant distinction between tools and methodological workflows. There's the word tools is used kind of indiscriminately in the context or in collocation with digital humanities. But there's clearly a significant difference between tools like edgetile.net, which is Arabic Almanac, which is absolutely amazing kind of a digital implementation of Romelian will, when you can have 35 dictionaries open right in front of you and just scroll through them, right? It's beautiful and it's amazing. But it doesn't change the research that we do, right? It helps us. You can go through 35 dictionaries right there, right now. It's an amazing tool, but it doesn't really add anything other than convenience. But when we're talking about methodological workflows, when we start with a text, an addition of a text or some kind of abstraction of a text, and we manipulate the text and run it through different analytical routines. So whether we were trying to check authorship attribution or trace texture use, which what other authors this particular author was using in writing his book, and so on and so on. That I think there's a very significant difference, because the first one, it's amazingly convenient, doesn't really add anything to your research conceptually, right? You can only do it faster. In the second case, you can actually answer questions which you cannot answer otherwise. And this is, for me, this is kind of a significant and crucial distinction. A last thing, that's a comment more about Theo's kind of focus on large scale, large projects, large teams, large collaborations. OpenITI project, which is now kind of a foundation of Kitab project, started as a very small, low scale project. There wasn't really any kind of big funding, big team or anything. A big part of it was built by me with close kind of collaboration in terms of methodological discussion and all these kind of things with Sarah and Matthew Miller and Gregory Crane, who was a kind of a spiritual father of digital Arabic humanities, I would say, even though he himself being a classicist. One thing that Theo did mention, I think, which I think is crucial, is training. You don't really need thousands or millions of euros. I mean, it's nice to have, but it's very difficult to get. So that's not what makes you a digital humanist. What makes you a digital humanist is training, right? What makes you an Arabist is your ability to read and understand and interpret Arabic text, right? What makes you a digital humanist is ability to understand how to manipulate data and how to apply different computational methods in order to get what you're interested in. That's what we really lack, is that we don't have, it's not really part of training of Arabist or Persianist or Ottomanist for that matter. And that's what we actually need to work on. We need training materials, we need ideally courses that would kind of send us along in this direction. I would stop here because I don't want to monopolize all the time, and thank you.
And I'm sure that we'll come back in the broader discussion. We can feed back into some of these questions. We are now going to hand it over to Sarah Savant, and we're also going to add a few people to the discussion on video. This is more of the academic workshop side of our event series, so we're trying to sort of mimic that a little bit by having a few more people sitting around the table. But for all of you, the 100 participants that we have watching online, please do add your questions to the chat box, to the Q&A box. And in the chat box, we have some links from the PowerPoints that were just put up in case you were interested in following up on some of the projects and things that were being talked about in the presentation. So go ahead, Sarah, thank you.
Okay, good, thank you. So I'm first just, I meant to speak more about Theo's presentation, but I'll just make a comment on Mahmoud's, which I've also had the great privilege of hearing before, and I am very, very much impressed by the work that you're doing at Kalīla wa-Dimna. You mentioned the most widely known things, the least understood is your starting quote. And I appreciated very much the points you made below it in terms of questions. Personally, I think the importance of your project is that the most widely known thing is the book, but it's actually the least well understood, you know, in the Arabic tradition. And this project has just such enormous potential to make us reconceptualize the meaning of bookness by taking a widely dispersed text, crossing languages, crossing genres, you know, it has multiple meanings. It really is quite slippery, Kalīla wa-Dimna, as a text. And it really is only through digital mechanisms, I think, that you can begin to get access to that sense of what it meant to be a book historically. So I love this project because it's, I think, a classic example of good digital humanities in the sense that in the modern age, we have an easier time actually accessing earlier ways of thinking about books than we did, for example, in the age of what we might come to call critical editions, you know, in the future. To just build on a little bit of maybe what Maxime has also said, I would point out that the Open ITI remains very open. So we actively encourage anyone to contribute data to the Open ITI, and by that I mean textual data, transcriptions. If you've come across, you know, a machine readable file for a book that we don't have, we would be grateful to have it. And the benefit of contributing your data is that we will be releasing text reuse results based on all of the data that's in our corpus. And so over time, by participating in this larger corpus, you'll gain access to a whole different kinds of data sets than you can now. For example, I say text reuse, but we're also talking about releasing a version of the corpus for stilometry. So, you know, as the field grows and I think more people become more able to engage with digital methods, you know, you want to avail yourself of the resources that exist. And this is definitely, I think, a major one for the field. The other thing Maxime is pointed out, I think quite correctly, is that training is essential, but the barrier there is shockingly low. I mean, you do not have to, you know, spend a lifetime to start to do work that's meaningful and interesting with DH. And you know, DataCamp is just one resource. I personally have used DataCamp. You can learn R, you know, over the course of a very short period, enough R, let's say, to make, you know, useful, you know, contributions to your research. So I would encourage people who are not affiliated to a major project to feel, you know, a sense of optimism, because the big projects are trying to build something collaboratively. The principles that unite them, I think, are fairly sound. We're trying very hard to communicate with each other. And if I could just run through a couple of principles that I think are key. open source. We have signed up to all of us, I think, that are currently have ERCs to the, to open data pilot, the open data agreements. They're kind of complicated. It's taken us a while to get our minds around them, but we all embrace them, and it's incredibly important that we share. So for example, on the transcription data that you're doing, Mahmoud, of course, that can go back into training for OCR. It's incredibly important to release that because work that's being done, on OCR needs training data. That's the great lack. And for manuscripts, if we want to be able to get witness, machine readable files of, let's say, as many witnesses to a text as we can, we need a lot of training data, and manuscripts are critical for that. Do not duplicate. So open source, do not duplicate efforts of other projects, very critical. If you are applying for funding, please, try to see ways to work together and collaboratively. It would be silly for us to all be going down the same paths. I would suggest individually, and this is my personal belief, I hope this doesn't sound too cynical, but one wants to do digital humanities, but I think one wants to also continue to ask questions that maybe are a bit conventional sometimes in their not only digital humanities questions. Engaging with the field meaningfully is critical, and sometimes the field thinks in DH and sometimes it doesn't. So I think trying to cross those boundaries to ask the questions that are sort of seminal to the field and connecting our work to the field is very critical. Perfection is the enemy of good. And Theo, as you were speaking, I think this is particularly relevant. Perfection's good, don't get me wrong. But I think that intermediate area that we don't all have to become developers. We don't all have to have the final and complete data set, before we begin to publish and understand things. That's a really critical thing to take on board. And that can be very hard, I think, for people doing their first book, their first major studies. You feel like you have to have everything nailed down. But actually, we can get a lot from low-hanging fruit. And finally, I would say, there is the issue that people, I think you have to put on your own mask. You have to do the work that gets your own research established and organized, but then do share, as much as possible. And that takes time. Releasing data, for example, through Zenodo does take time, but it should be done, by all projects as soon as possible. But I would just say that thank you very, very much. And I think we can all think very profitably about that sort of middle territory between, developers and people who are Luddites, I can say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I think we're now going to add some new panelists who will be joining in the conversation. But I wanted to give Mahmoud and Theo a chance to respond. Just very quickly to what has been said. You don't have to respond point by point to every single question or every single thing, but just a quick thoughts in response to the questions and comments of our panelists.
Yeah, if I may start. No, the question is developing tools as scholarly practice. The idea, I'm pretty much stuck doing it this way, because when you go to the industry, they have to keep exploiting you to get more money and rolling out features, and there's a lot of counterproductive practices in it. So I pretty much have to do it myself to exploit the whole potential of solutions in the programming world. So we had to do it ourselves. We tried talking with companies. There are a lot of counterproductive things going on. So we have to program it ourselves. And there's the idea that of open source philosophy, how to collaborate with open source coding, to structure the code in a certain way, to host it in a certain way, to be able to work on the same code with minimal communication. Because communication is not always easy. Like, we are all multilingual. It's hard to find a common language. It's not that easy, and people in DH have not following the open source principle very well. Like, the open source free is not as in free to use, free as in gratis, is free as in libre. No one has control. No one contributes what they want when they want. Other projects had strict rules on how to contribute and when to contribute, because again in the academia there is other counterproductive thing is the idea of credit, who did what when, which is counterproductive in software development, because you have to keep testing, you have to keep experimenting. It takes time. For me, yeah, the software development has to keep going on. The idea of who did what is not important, because it will remain unfinished project and unfinished product for a long time. So it's still an open question. I'm still experimenting. I'm still facing technical difficulties every day. I'm still learning how to do open source correctly. So it's not clear completely where I am going. I have a certain vision. I hope it will be realized, but I'm forced into this situation and I'm enjoying it. Yeah. Great.
Theo, do you have a?
Yeah, the one point that I would get back to was the discussion of open ITI and how that started. It has its origins as an open source software effort that was not always institutionally supported and remains open to outside collaborators. And I think that's wonderful. And that's sort of exactly what I'd like to see more of. So I think one lesson from looking at what can happen to something like open ITI is that if you start a project like that yourself or with a few of your friends in sort of an informal, non-institutional basis, you never really know where it's going to go, where it's going to end up, what future collaborations and affiliations might be possible. And that's one of the best things about sort of distributed open source software development and distributed open source digital humanities research, is that the possibilities are really left open from that starting point. I think I'll leave it at that, because I just want to say that one point I'm entirely on the same page with you guys, I think, on at least with regard to open ITI and what that sort of represents and wanting more things like that.
Great. There are a few clarificatory questions from the Q&A box. The first is a question about the creation of a transcription for each line, Professor Laura Harb has asked, if you're creating a unique sort of tag or code for each line across manuscripts, how do we deal with the fact that there are, with the variations, with the fact that Kalīla wa-Dimna, I mean, it is one of these, although I completely agree with what Sarah has said, which is that, thinking digitally and thinking in this and using digital tools has allowed us to sort of think in ways that might be more similar to the way people thought about text in the past. But we have all these variations between Kalīla wa-Dimna manuscripts. How do we deal with the fact that there might be a unique chunk in some other manuscript? How do you manage all of this, the unruliness? Mahmoud?
To be honest, I don't understand the question fully.
If there's a chunk of text in one manuscript that doesn't exist in others, you're creating unique codes, right? For unique labels when you enter things into Lera.
Okay.
So how do you deal with this, with the variations?
Let me share the screen one more time quickly. We have the codicology part and the literature part. So lines are saved, and at the same time there are pointers to dissect text into literary units. The unit is agnostic about the line. It doesn't matter. Like the line breaks doesn't matter when we do literary comparison.
So you chunk it into literary units.
Exactly. It's
rather than line units.
Line is important for the codicology. When you're revising the transcription and where is the word, and when we are doing the literary comparison, line breaks are irrelevant. We just put them side by side, and line breaks go away. Have I answered yes, an answer to the question?
But if you had a new literary unit in a new manuscript, you just sort of invent a new literary chunk for a label for that new chunk of text.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it does strike me that this is one of the things that we do in the project that is perhaps not quite what people were, the way that people were thinking about these texts in the past. But it's sort of it's necessary for working with things. And there are a lot of great questions as well about. But there was a question about whether other projects can use. We've talked a lot about the conceptual issue of open access, but can other projects use this exact same sort of portal for transcribing manuscripts? Because it is, being able to transcribe manuscripts in this way does seem to be a huge benefit to somebody who works with manuscripts and wants to transcribe them more easily.
So right now, if someone would like to have the code, they can have the code right away, but they need their own web developer to get it up and running. The main issue, I can't host anyone else's data. Cannot give them access to the interface and host their data. This is the biggest challenge. I plan in the future to make the software repackageable in multiple scenarios, so a lone scholar can also make use of the interface. But right now, not yet. If someone would like access to the code, just send me an email and I will give them access to the code, and they can try to tinker around with it or hire a web developer to adjust it for their use. They can have the code right away.
Okay, and we have some new panelists. If they'd like to turn on their videos so we can see them. I believe the PI of our project, Beatrice Grundler, has her hand up and would like to ask a question. So unmute yourself and ask your question, Beatrice.
I wanted to add to Mahmoud's answer and to your question just quickly, what we do when we find a new paragraph. And well, first of all, when we find a paragraph in one manuscript that is not in any other, we get very excited. But then there are two levels at which we can do so. It can be a very long paragraph with self-contained content. Then, as Mahmoud explained, we would define a new label, and that would then change the structure of our LERA interface. So that would be a larger structural unit for bird's eye view. And those you can also calculate, and you can see how many units per two manuscripts do overlap, and then you can do heat maps and all those lovely things. The other thing is if it is within a segment, and then it's still at this is where developer and scholar sort of interlink. This then would be dealt with online or by printout with a fine-tooth combed analysis, and that's you have to do with your brain and eyes, and you don't necessarily need a computer for that. So it depends basically on the scale of the unique portion, how you treat it.
And we have two other panelists, Esteban Cristonegui from of Exeter and Arazu Azad from Oxford. Please join in or use the raise hand feature if you'd like to get my attention. We have some other questions. So one really interesting question from Yusri Saadawi is, how do we deal with manuscript notes, right? This project is heading towards a critical edition or a synoptic critical edition of Kalīla wa-Dimna. What about these manuscript notes? How are they dealt with in the project? How is this processed using the software? Because this seems to lie outside the old model of LERA with literary units, right? These aren't literary units. So how are they, how is this other level of manuscript information, manuscript notes, how does that play into the project as a whole?
Should I answer, Professor Grundler?
Go ahead, Mahmoud, I'll add.
We keep track of them right now, and Boris Liebrenz in Bibliotheca Arabica has been doing interesting work, also gathering names and places and so on, and we plan to somehow link the two things, do the same thing that he does, and somehow link observations. But we do keep track of them.
Great. Beatrice, you have.
And what Mahmoud has not shown yet, because it's still in the works, we have a manuscript portal, and we collect comprehensive information about every manuscript. So the codicology, the version, and relation and reduction. And in the version part, we keep track of are there manuscript notes, where, how extensive, and so on. So that in the next step, should we also want to digitize these as they do in the Bibliotheca Arabica, we can do so and we know where to find them, and they help us give the textual history, also the reading notes and the commentaries. So all of that, we found versions of Kalīla on the margin. All of that is part of our text.
Great. So Arazu has her hand up as well. Could you please join us? And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for asking me to join, and thank you so much for running this session. It's super helpful for me. I'm one of those big projects, I'm afraid, that Theo mentioned, that we just started on the 1st of June. And we've got a digital humanities segment in our Invisible East program. And it's largely, I think, Sarah and Maxime's fault, because they have been so great at selling the Open ITI to me. But of course, I think we're all sold on it. You know, we need to share whatever information we do have. And I really want to echo what Theo said about the ecosystem and creating those synergies. And I just wanted to share the experience as a very early starter in this. And I've just hired our postdocs. We've got 3 amazingly clever postdocs. And they cover about 15 languages, going from Arabic all the way to Khotanese, spoken in China, an old Iranian language spoken in China. And we're all trying to get our heads around how we're going to make this digitally, humanely, humanistically possible. So I just want to say we need to have more of these conversations to help us, because we're really researchers. We're not the software developers, but luckily we have people like Sarah and Maxime who can create that bridge for us. So the one thing I think they both taught me, and I wanted to share, was don't rush into creating your digital tools. And that was the best advice I got, because I immediately thought, oh God, we need to create this massive thing now. And no, so we're actually working old style in Word right now, just to get a feel for what the data are that we're working with, and to get a feel of how we should be asking the questions, and how the digital sort of digital corpus that we will be creating can help us answer those questions. And I think that's
made me panelist.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
I'm sorry.
The other thing I wanted to say was what we bring in is also other languages. So I think we're learning from you guys who are working in Arabic and Persian, but we will be bringing in Bactrian and Sogdian and Middle Persian and also Persian texts that are not big literary texts. So we're bringing in fragments of literary texts that come from very local sources. We'll be bringing in documents. They're now growing every day, but we now have 1,000 Persian medieval documents, going from something close to 0 only a few years ago. So, and these documents have place names in them. They have fiqh in them. They have all kinds of things that we want to cross-reference with the literary sources. And that's why we're reaching out to Sarah and others to try to find ways to make our data interoperable. And we've got an informal group of people, there's no money behind it, with Sarah and with Marina Rusto, for example, in Princeton and others. And we're starting to think about that. How can we make our data interoperable? So just wanted to plug that in, these sort of random thoughts. And if there are any questions, please do come back to me. But thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions that's been there's been a very interesting chat with Yanis Tsiligakis in the Q&A about intellectual rights and copyright. So we have the original texts, right? The manuscript texts that are not under copyright. but the annotations that we are creating, or the transcriptions that we are creating, and the digital versions that we are producing, what is the sort of nature of the copyright of these kinds of texts? I mean, how is Maxime has been responding and chatting in the Q&A, but I think it would be interesting to raise this question in this format and see if there's a response or a discussion of how intellectual rights and copyright of the textual data works, because we've talked about the code and things like that being open, but what about the sort of textual data? How do we think about the copyright intellectual rights of those texts? Is there somebody who can respond to that? Sarah, Maxime, Sarah, go ahead.
Unless Beatrice, I mean, you have surely thought this through for your project. I can just tell you what I understand, at least. In terms of licensing, so for us, we have different Creative Commons licensing arrangements for different types of data. And for example, I'm not going to remember which one at this moment for what, but if the Zenodo release has a particular license, the work we're working with the Qatar National Library, and we're working on a portal, that has a set of other licenses. The data that we generate for text reuse will have a set of licenses. So it is, there's different types of licensing. I would say that not everything is, I don't think it's quite correct to say that because the texts are old as such, they're necessarily free of copyright. And I would also say there's an issue of ethics that goes beyond copyright too, of course. Images can be very much, of course, from the libraries in which they're taken, and rely more on Beatrice to know. Images are, of course, very much intellectual property of the libraries through which you access them. We cannot we can't reproduce the print images that we use, perhaps, to work sometimes on text. We can't put those online. So we can, by the notions that we understand from consultation with lawyers, extract what is the text itself. We feel sometimes a little uncomfortable about this. I mean, the notion that the text is some unmediated thing, of course, is very much antithetical to our general thinking, to be frank. But the legal situation, would hold that if you extract a text and you've transformed it, into a machine-readable file, and therefore run processes on it, then you're free. But the images are, I think, for so many projects, a big hindrance is this issue of the images, because you would really like to be having, images linked, to all sorts of data, and it's very tricky, in that case. But Beatrice, you must have had to think about this a lot for your project.
Yes, this is absolutely true. And there are a variety of different forms of spreading and sharing, and it depends precisely on the type of data. And with the images, you do have to have an agreement with each library, and each library has different rules on using it in print, online, permanently, one-off. And there are wonderful libraries like the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, where everything is open. And then there are other libraries that put you through quite a lot of work and also high cost. And this is an additional burden on the project. And it's a one-by-one case. As for the software licensing, we will also do that, but we are still in an open process. And we also have to talk with our partner, which is Halle-Wittenberg Universität, and their project. They're quite interested in making it available to other future users, but we'll have to first agree with them on how to proceed on that. Then as for our research data, we are of course interested in making that available for free and in the widest possible way. And that goes with what the ERC desires, what our university stands for, and also we as researchers, we would like to, that we will not finish. So if you don't spread our data in the widest possible way, we don't allow the next generation of colleagues to improve and build on it.
Esteban, you have your hand up. Please go ahead. Thank you for coming.
It's a joy to join you. I don't know how to digitally raise my hand, so I did it manually. So I have two questions. Please tell me if to ask them separately or at once. The first is a very simple when and what and when question. So what's the ultimate goal of this current project is to have all extant manuscript, Arabic manuscript digitalized, or even the Persians, I don't know for sure, and processed in a way as described by Mahmoud. And is that the scope? And when will you launch this? When all will be on, or you will launch it in bits? So when can this amazing tool be started to be there to use? That's the first, and I have another one maybe for after this.
So a question of a timeline for the synoptic edition and for the side by
scope
side.
And the timeline. Yeah.
So there are two stages. We are still in the stage of data collection and data analysis. Like how the edition is going to look like, we don't know yet. Like we have a lot of ideas of a synoptic edition, like how Lera looks like right now. But I'm dreaming of making some sort of innovative, spectacular interface. But we're not getting there. We're still finding a lot of insights. How the final edition is going to look like, we don't know yet. We're still in the data collection phase. When the tools are going to be available, I'm not sure yet. I'm still focusing on making the tool completely up and running for the project. There are a lot of technical difficulties. Once this is done, I will start working on demodularizing and repackaging them for reuse. But it can be a couple of years. Yeah.
Beatrice, I think you have something to add. You're muted again.
This is, of course, the most important question for people interested in the project, and the ultimate goal is that out of the 140 manuscripts, we pick 5 or 6 and produce full transcriptions of those. That being said, the work we kind of do has become more complex, and we have become more perfectionist while working on it. So a first step will be a one chapter, and then a second step will be several select chapters that we have digitized, and those represented by manuscripts that we select. And why we select some manuscripts over others, I cannot explain today. We talk about that in the last workshop, but there is some difficult decision making to be done, because in a way you're interpreting by editing, you're interpreting the textual history, and for that you need to really know what you're doing.
Esteban, you had a follow-up as well?
Yes, so and it is something which you haven't discussed, but I think it's crucial. It's the idea of recognition, so as producing books and introducing the book as a form, no one knows better than you, Beatrice, and you all, that it was not universally welcome, and it was not universally welcome without suspicions and so on. So a new technologies always comes with difficulties, and now we are having the same when it comes to digital tools. That in practice, I think most of researchers are using them, but when it comes to recognize this officially, this is not obvious. So on the one hand, I'm not sure how much institutions recognize your efforts, what you put, and such things as the REF in England recognize this incredible amount of work, which is not research as required, as usually required. So that's one thing. The other is that I'm constantly having to fight for my references to digital resources or even databases like archive.com and so on. When I put them into my references, editors wants them to take out. So and the reason, there are legitimate reasons behind that. One is, I think, the fear of legal issues, and the other fear is probably the volatility of these resources. Like Theo's, I'm just about to submit a chapter on Kalīla wa-Dimna, and I would immediately put Theo's Kalīla wa-Dimna reader on it, but they might say that, given the fact that this is something that it's not likely to last forever, but will be migrated to another platform, they might object to it. So what do you think of how to make digital referencing and all sort of this work more recognized, allowed to use them in referencing than how it will, how this huge.
This is a great question. Unfortunately, we're quickly running out of time, and I want to give a chance to respond. Theo, do you have a response to the issue of Esteban has raised this very important issue of recognition? How is this work recognized both on the sort of, you know, referencing level and on the sort of career level? Do you have any thoughts on this?
On the question of citing things like that, I think it's difficult, but it's gotten a little bit easier over time. And I think every year, hopefully, editors and publishers are a little bit more open to accepting references like that. It's something that I'm always pushing as well, where for Persian poetry, there's a popular web corpus called Ganjur. And I like to cite Ganjur sometimes because it's easy and everyone can access it. And there are a lot of positive things about that. And I just try to push it. I try to get away with it. And if they say no, then I find something else. But I think we need to always be pushing the envelope and seeing if we can expand what we're able to cite to be more in line with our actual research process. Because ideally what we're citing should be true to the way that we're conducting our research. But, you know, there's other things that we need to develop as well. Like we should have tools that allow us to download a permanent copy, a permanent fully functional copy of a web page. There are tools that do things like that, but there should be ways that we can provide guarantees to whoever's editing or publishing our work that, you know, we have a complete archived, permanently accessible version of everything that we cite or something like that. So it's something that I'd like to see develop more in the future. But for now, I just push it wherever I can.
That's fantastic. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We have lots of questions still up on the Q&A box, but don't worry, we're going to download that and give it to the panelists so that they can hopefully sort of respond to you if we didn't get around to your question. And as we close up, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and especially thank our presenters, our discussants, and our panelists in the discussion section. For their time and for their comments and for this very interesting sort of interaction that we've been able to have in these strange times. We look forward to seeing many of you in the next 2 weeks. We have 2 more academic workshops next Monday and the Monday after next. Stay well, and we'll see you then.